Today we have for this Leaders of Neurosurgery series, we have Dr. Teodoro Dagi with us. I'm Dr. Mark Preul, and I am glad to welcome him to this series. I think it's a very important series for neurosurgery to have a video and oral record of our leaders in neurosurgery. And today I welcome Teo, and we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of the history of neurosurgery and the history of medicine and how that relates to neurosurgery. We've been a professional specialty that really is fairly recent, and about the turn of the 19th to the 20th century is when neurosurgery really came into its beginning of its professionalization. And so, there really wasn't purposeful neurosurgery before that. What we know is neurosurgery really starts at the end of the 19th century. So we're a very recent specialty, and I think that Teo has had an immense perspective on this, and I am really pleased to interview him because Teo I have known. I calculated it for 4 years short of 4 decades, and that is a relationship that really has evolved from a mentor to a student, me as the student, and now as good friends and colleagues sharing leadership positions in the AANS and especially within the history section. So I want to welcome Teo, and our topic today is his career, and what it has, how it has enlivened him professionally and personally, and it's going to center around history. So, Teo, I'll let you do some introduction, and then we'll sort of start a little bit of a structured interview and see if we can have some fun.
Thank you, Mark. It's really an honor to be here and an honor for you to have you interview me. This should be a lovely discussion, and I look forward to it. So just a little bit on background. I trained at the Mass General, and I trained at the neurosurgical unit of the Guy's, Maudsley, and King's College Hospitals in London. The latter because I was interested in European neurosurgery, and also because I was particularly interested in epilepsy. And that was the Center for Temporal Lobe Epilepsy in Europe at the time. I then went on to work on 2-deoxyglucose, the predecessor of PET scanning, at the NIH, had a military obligation, which I served at Walter Reed, went to Brown, and from Brown went to Georgia Tech and a private practice in Atlanta. And from there was recruited to the Harvard MIT program in health sciences and technology, where in addition to working in neurosurgical areas, I also worked on something that had intrigued me thoroughly, which was innovation in neurosurgery. To the best of my knowledge, the course that we put together at Georgia Tech in translational surgery and also translational medicine was the first such course in the country, and probably was contemporaneous to the design program at Stanford and the program in biomedical entrepreneurship at MIT. But I went to the MIT program, and after the MIT program was recruited to Belfast as the chairman of the medical school, a role that I served with the hope of helping to redevelop a medical school that had suffered grievously in the Civil War, the so-called Troubles in Northern Ireland, and did that until the late 2018 period, just before the pandemic. And from that point on, was involved with the Mayo Clinic, where I was recruited to be a professor. And that's where I am now. So that in brief is what I've done and what I've been involved with.
And I think one of the great things about this as we get into this interview is your career has really been varied, and I know some of the more unique facets as well that you haven't brought into it, and because of your great humility. But you've been a diplomat, you've been involved in some really interesting military endeavors as well. You've had a career that has taken you all over the world, and you've had a real, I think, a career that has let you see various aspects that really impact neurosurgery. So, what we want to concentrate on today that we agreed was our focus on the history of medicine and the history of neurosurgery, and you are uniquely qualified to do that. You've been our section chair several times in the history section. The history section is a very unique section in the AANS. It only is the only section that is really of the AANS itself. It's a one association section, and it was started to really foster an awareness of the history of neurosurgery and why that matters to us. So I guess that's the first question that I have for you, and we've sort of gone over that a little bit, so that we can think about these things over a couple of days. And what brought you into the history of neurosurgery, Teo, and what does it do for us as neurosurgeons?
So history is an interesting discipline. It gives us perspective. Some people think of history as only the past, but the history is really about explanations. I had someone tell me once that if you want to understand history, if you want to do history, you need to think about it the same way you'd think of a detective's work in a certain area. You get curious about something. And if you want to write history, there are two things you need to do. You have to try to understand what the puzzle is on the basis of whatever facts that you think you have, whatever knowledge you think you have. You believe certain things to be true. For the sake of argument, let's say you believe that the neurophysiology that you do in animals is akin to the neurophysiology of the human animal. Now, on what basis do you say that? Why does that hold true? What's the basis for your certainty? And once you say that, you look for contradictions. You look for contradictions that say, well, maybe in this case it doesn't. Anatomically, of course, we have lots of examples. For example, we still have the torcular hierophily in the human brain, except the torcular really is something that only exists in the bovine brain. And yet we have a name for it in the human brain, even though the structure doesn't exactly exist. But there are plenty of other examples. One example to speak of is we believe that there are certain things that interfere with fusion in spine surgery. Well, why do we think so? And how did we come to develop that as an interest? 30 years ago, very few neurosurgeons did fusions. Then over the past 20 years, it's fusions and spine surgery have become a central part of neurosurgery. What does that mean to the profession? What does that mean in terms of training, in terms of science, in terms of acceptable research, in terms of publications? What does that mean in terms of manpower needs in neurosurgery? And have we adequately dealt with perhaps a shift in emphasis from cranial to structural spine. To understand neurosurgery is to start with any point you like, look at the changes, and say, why did the changes occur? When did they occur? Where did they occur? Who led them? How did they influence the profession? And ultimately, what do they mean for the profession in the future? And that's why history starts in the past, but it takes us into the future, and it adds a strategic element to our thinking about our profession.
Teo, you trained in a center, and well, not just one center, but let's take your main residency training. You trained in a center, as I did, where really history was probably, I don't know if it was for you, I know it was for me, every day in the operating room. And I trained in the early 90s, was finished in 1995. You were, of course, ahead of me by some years, probably about 10 or so. But I know you must have every day been exposed to the history of neurosurgery in some facet, either hearing about famous people at Harvard or neurosurgeons that had passed through, probably going back to Cushing. As I did in Montreal, I heard, I don't think there was a day that went by that I didn't hear something about Dr. Penfield. And we, the residents, we called him Dr. Penfield as if he was still alive. And the other greats that were at M&I, at the M&I, Bill Cohn, we called him Dr. Cohn. And that's the way the staff referred to them too. It was as if these people were still walking the halls and seeing patients, and that, you know, we were doing that, and we were fully immersed in that situation. Tell me about your experience like that. You must have had the same thing.
Very parallel, absolutely. So I trained under Dr. Sweet and under Dr. Zervis. Dr. Sweet trained with Sherrington. So there was a direct connection to the beginnings of modern neurophysiology in England and then in the United States as well, because the Sherrington School had great influence in the United States. There was also a constant recapitulation of the idea that the neurosurgeon needed to be a scientist. And not just a scientist, but preferably, not dogmatically, but preferably a neuroscientist. And so the question was always, what could you learn from every case? Much as Sherrington said, what can you learn from every experiment? Dr. Zervis also trained abroad, trained in France, and developed his interest in pituitary surgery in France. And that brought in a completely different set of observations. The French did things differently. And Dr. Zervis was very quick to say, we do it this way, other people do it other ways. Go learn how other ways can be accomplished, how other paths to the same goal can be accomplished. And was also a very inquiring mind, and spoke constantly of surgical history. And I think both Dr. Sweet and Dr. Zervis were closet historians. Dr. Sweet knew most of the people who, from the time of the interwar period till the time that he retired, were active in neurosurgery, and they were his friends. So we had them passing through. You could not help but be exposed to people who had done very interesting things, and I dare say even great things. And the other members of the department were the same. Dr. Chelberg, who developed proton beam, Dr. Ballantyne, who worked on cingulotomy. I can go on for hours about each of those people, but what all of them had, was a sense of historical perspective, even though they weren't necessarily historians. So they said this was a problem that people have been struggling with for so many years. What can we do that hasn't been tried before and hasn't failed? what can we do to innovate and to solve these problems in neurosurgery? So basically, you had four things that the neurosurgeon was responsible for or accountable for. One was obviously good technology, good technique, good patient care. The second was advancing science and advancing the profession. The third was recording it in such a way that other people could learn from it. And the fourth was teaching, instructing, and training so that the knowledge would not end with that neurosurgeon. I think to those of us who went through that program and programs like that, like you, for example, those four elements were key to the profession.
And I think it, you know, I, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about when I give history talks here at the BNI to the residents or involve the residents or fellows or medical students in projects. There really comes a motivation from them that I don't see often unless they do these sorts of projects that really give them a perspective. And I think that as well, when I look back over my my involvement in clinical neurosurgery, you know, I learned that there were principles that didn't change. Principles, as you've just said, about surgical technique. It doesn't, you know, really matter what necessarily the instrument you have in your hand is. It may make it easier, but the actual surgical technique principles that we've learned don't change. They haven't changed for centuries, if at all. Really, we've got technology that makes our lives easier. So, in that sense, what do we do for, or what should we do with trainees, involving them in the history of our profession? How do we enliven them in this? We live in a time when, you know, there are all these iPhone apps, everything's sort of instantaneous as far as communication. Everybody carries an iPhone now. It's like the whole world has a pager. And that's what it's like to, you know, live with a pager. I think the rest of the world has found out about that. I'm not sure that they like it very much. So what do we do? How do we enliven this with our trainees when they're in this sort of a milieu today?
I think there's three things. Number one, you need to convey information to trainees. And the information is cognitive and it's performative. Let's put that in one box. Second thing you need to do is to give people a sense of literacy. I'm not speaking now about historical literacy. I'm speaking about neurosurgical literacy. What are the controversies? How do people think about ideas? How do new ideas come to the fore? And very importantly, how do they get adopted? And then the third thing we want to convey to people is a sense of, I'm going to call this very broadly, medical ethics, neurosurgical ethics, a philosophy of what we do, what we hold ourselves accountable for, and what we hold the profession accountable for. We are a humanitarian profession. Our ambit, our purpose has to do with the benefit of patients, the solution to problems in science, the solutions to problem in medicine, improving people's lives, and being thoughtful about it so that while we improve people's lives, we also take care of them as they are. It's not easy. There's always an inevitable conflict between the time needed to train residents and to train ourselves in things that we need to take care of patients and the time it takes to learn something or to expand our knowledge in history of medicine, philosophy of medicine, in our culture. And there has to be a balance. Some people are more interested in the technology, the techniques, and the patient care. And for some people, there will be equal interest in the history and in the philosophy. Certainly for anybody who writes a paper, the introduction to a paper, the context of a paper, the discussion of a paper, the conclusion of a paper, each of those sections are sections that can involve, and in many cases ought to involve, at least a historical sense, historical suasion, because it tells us what came before and why we are doing what we're doing. And so what I would think is the way to start is when we teach residents, trainees, fellows to write, to have them understand the basis for whatever study they're doing, not only in terms of clinical need, but also in terms of the history. Who did what before? Why was it done? Why does it have to be done again? What do we expect out of a study? What happens next? That's actually history. And that's the kind of history of neurosurgery that we ought to be bringing to our trainees and to our colleagues.
Now, I want to ask you about what some of your favorite topics have been, and I really have been associated with you for a long time. We've worked on several topics together, and what I want to also mention is that Teo has been an originator with Dr. Sam Greenblatt, and of what I think is really something that is a unique section activity, and that is one of the breakfast seminars for the AANS for years has or had been a graduate style seminar type breakfast seminar or breakfast a meeting, and where there were readings that were put out, active readings. You couldn't come unless you had read. Basically, that was the edict that had been put out, that if you want to come to the breakfast seminar, you better have done the readings. And we did various readings from the history of brain tumor surgery, the history of science in neurosurgery, and a real progression from really when our specialty has started up through, and you have led those discussions, many of them, and have had favorite topics. And by virtue of that, I had a medical student recently, well over the past couple of years, a very bright girl, who wrote a marvelous paper that she really educated herself on and educated me also. She took a project that she had done in her undergraduate career at Johns Hopkins and wrote on the 16th century battlefield and the occurrences of neurological injuries from that time, and that especially involved Ambroise Paré. I just heard yesterday from a medical student. She is now in her fourth year. And I heard from a first-year medical student that she sent over to my department here at the Barrow and said, you need to get with Dr. Preul because that project I did for him made my interest in medical school really spark. And that I probably wouldn't be in medical school today if it hadn't been for that project that I did with him. That was really a really fantastic project that really she delved into primary sources from France, from all over, really educated herself about that. That really excited me. When I hear those sorts of information come back, that's thrilling for me that I've made that impact. Tell me about I know you've had so many of those. Tell me about your favorite topics in neurosurgery and how you've done that same thing.
Just a few. Um, One of them is how you study the brain. So when stereotaxy first got started in neuroscience, it didn't get started in neurosurgery, it got started in neuroscience. The idea was how to stimulate the brain without stimulating the cortex. So the depths of the brain without stimulating the cortex. And that emanated from and resulted in the idea of three-dimensional brain mapping. And that leads directly to what we do today in terms of neuronavigation. That train of thought, how the ideas developed and how they consolidated in a practical way, is absolutely fascinating. History of neurosurgical diagnosis. We go from the development of the neurological examination in the 19th century, which, by the way, does not really settle until the first, and some people would argue the second decades of the 20th century, what the neurological examination was and what it consisted of. That's critical to what neurosurgeons do, because many of the decisions that neurosurgeons undertook were decisions about topography, localization, to the extent possible, preoperative diagnosis, operative approach, and operative technique. Absolutely critical. The association of neurosurgery and science, neuroscience. So Dr. Sweet used to teach that there were three ways of doing neurosurgery. You could be a surgeon who liked to operate and then decided to operate on the brain. You could be a neurologist, frustrated with neurology, you wanted to do something, and so you went into neurosurgery. Or you could be a neuroscientist and decided that you wanted to study patients while you were helping them and do that both for the purpose of the profession and for the purpose of the science. And I think that that's very correct. But that motif is really critical in the history of science and the history of revolutions in science. In terms of diagnostic works, one of the most interesting issues was angiography. Angiography was developed by Moniz, a Nobel Prize winner, who was also involved in lobotomy. And he was a neurologist who signed the Treaty of Versailles as a diplomat on behalf of Portugal. As it happens, he wanted to become the ruler. He lost the election. Frustrated, he went back to his laboratory and decided to concentrate on how you image vessels. This was in the 20s. He chose the best contrast agent that there was at the time, thorotrast. Thorotrast turns out to be highly carcinogenic. It wasn't until well after World War II that new contrast agents were developed. And it wasn't until Dr. Yassergil in 1952 wrote about angiography at the suggestion of Dr. Kryenbuhl that the techniques and the science of angiography, not just to look for shifts, but to look for vascular abnormalities and perhaps identify tumors and perhaps even diagnose them preoperatively, that began to emerge. That created a new area of research within neurosurgery, which is one of the very, very interesting things. And we have lots of examples like that today, ranging from genomics, epigenetics, the basis for tumors, new treatments for tumors. All of them have historical basis. And in the spine, all you need to do is to go back to the turn of the 20th century and read the papers about orthopedic surgeons trying to treat orthopedic problems, tuberculous orthopedic problems in the spine, with whalebone as a basis for grafting. And you understand several things: what the innovation was, how they used materials, what courage it takes, but perhaps more than that, what it takes to get a new technique examined, adopted, and improved. And I think that those three issues, examining a technique, adopting a technique, improving a technique, are some of the core functions that we have in neurosurgery. And the perspective that you get historically is very, very valuable.
I think those are excellent points. I've got several research fellows that have been very active in one of our trades of research here at the Barrow, and that's been fluorescence in neurosurgery, and especially the endomicroscopic technology now, the confocal endomicroscopic technology that actually can show cells by a handheld imaging system. I think it was a surprise to one of them when, as you say, there's a great history that goes with these modern technologies. And I pointed him to some references that had been published in the early 60s and the 40s about fluorescein. And a couple of these research fellows thought that fluorescein had just come on the market, was a new fluorophore, a new dye, and were surprised to find that fluorescein was actually decades old, had been approved for decades. And then I pointed them to a couple papers in the early 1960s of Wilder Penfield acquiring intraoperative photographs of AVMs in the brain as the fluorescein traveled through those AVMs, and the process of the various parts of the vasculature of the open brain becoming photographed. And they were quite surprised at that. I think that is an essential part of having a perspective. So I state that and ask this question because our medical schools don't seem to be teaching history. The medical schools here do not teach a history course. The medical students are automatically sort of put into a curriculum that is all about disease modules and pathology modules, physiology module, all the modules that kind of take anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, biochemistry, and relate those now into a clinical setting where they are immediately introduced into disease processes. When I was at Johns Hopkins for a year and a half at the Institute of the History of Medicine, that we as graduate students were very involved in the Hopkins History of Medicine course. Hopkins had a straight history of medicine course, and interestingly enough, the course was usually packed. Every medical student showed up to this course. They really enjoyed it. I don't see that much in other medical schools. I don't know if Hopkins actually still does that course. I would imagine they do. How do we enliven this in the medical school and the residency curriculum? Is there a way we should be doing it? Should we be doing it? Because what I don't hear often from residents is how they refer to their teachers. It's sort of been a change. I still revere my teachers in a historical sense. I even revere the teachers I didn't even have, the ones that were dead, as I've commented on. So what are your thoughts on that?
A few things. First of all, we have to acknowledge the challenge of time in teaching medicine. Increasingly, students in medical school are being asked to take a fifth year at their own expense before applying to residencies like neurosurgery, other specialty surgical residencies, to learn research, to do some work. Now, I don't know whether that's a good idea or that's a bad idea. Let's leave that out. But when they do, it's an opportunity to introduce something else. It perhaps is an opportunity for us as consultants, as attendings, to speak to the students, speak to the residents, and in the course of what we do day to day, also teach them about the history of what we do and why we do it. It's also something that we ought to perhaps encourage residents who would be so inclined to learn on their own as they start writing papers. I think it's pretty much axiomatic that we want our residents, at least in training, to contribute to the literature and to contribute the profession by advancing it and by innovation. But they have to have a basis when they write. So just as if anybody goes to graduate school, the first thing they're taught in graduate school is how to look at the literature, how to break it down and how to consult it, and then how to refer to it. I think that perhaps in residency, one of the things on an easier rotation that residents ought to be encouraged to do is to learn a little bit about the neurosurgical historical literature, how to reference it, where it is, who's written it, what they can find that's of interest to them. Neurosurgeons are, on the whole, are extremely broad thinkers. On the whole, they're some of the best minds around. One of the dangers in neurosurgery is boredom. We talk about it in terms of burnout sometimes, but it's also simple boredom. One of the things that history allows you to do is to take a different perspective on what you do day to day and to put what you do, and to some extent yourself, in the context of a field that has progressed and is progressing and has that humanitarian purpose we keep on talking about. We now realize the importance of global neurosurgery. We all acknowledge a responsibility to look not just in our own community, but elsewhere as well, to understand how to do that, with whom to do it, when to do it, also benefits from an historical perspective, because the mistakes that have been made before will be made again, even though we'd like to avoid them as well as we possibly can. So I don't think the answer is a course in medical school for medical students, even though I'm all for it. I think the answer is, as you do what you want to do, learn the history. If it engages you, write about the history. If it doesn't engage you in the sense of writing, teach the history and make it a part of what we do, so that our culture, the culture of our profession, not only persists, but continues to enlarge and to embrace what we do in the past, what we have done in the past, what we do in the present, and what we try to do in the future.
Teo, I fully agree with you that our residents and students become much better writers when they engage in a historical topic, and not only writers, but much better investigators. They sort of assume, as you've said, an investigative, journalistic explorer sense. I think the feedback that I often get from residents or students who engage in a historical topic is that those projects take more time and more dedication to write and to confirm details and to sleuth them than some of our scientific technological projects do, where the data is, fully at hand. You're putting together conclusions based on the results that are there in front of you. The sort of time scale is not very long. When they have to really investigate something that takes some sometimes frustration of trying to find and confirm primary sources, information from primary sources, when they just can't take somebody's word for it who's written some secondary article, or that has secondary sources where they just perhaps promote what has been written before, but may not be accurate. They really find, I think, a new way to look at their scientific and technological projects of trying to confirm, am I really right about what I'm writing about? And what I find is that their projects that culminate into papers no longer are just sort of positive outlook projects where everything works. where they write about that this is a solution for everything. And what I've done here, everything that I show you, oh, this is the better way. I've got all positive results. I mean, it's amazing that our literature is all about positive results. If you think about it, a good paper may be a negative result paper. We don't see many of those. But what I find in my residents and students is that when they've done historical work, their discussions tend to be more well-rounded. They tend to evaluate what are some of the disadvantages that I've found in relationship to the advantages that I found, and let's consider the whole situation. What have you found that I've got to believe that your influence on residents and students has been the same.
I couldn't have put it any better. Part of what we're talking about is perhaps we can put it in two ways. One is, it was once pointed out to me that any area of science, any area of humanities can benefit from putting the question, the hypothesis, in a very simple form. On the basis of X, Y, and Z, something we believe, we think A, B, and C are true. But when we look at it, we find that's not necessarily the case. How come? Why is that so? And that's the basis, the introduction for an intellectual journey, for an experimental and scientific journey, and really for a career. That's number one. Number two is the question of how we know something. What bestows us certainty? So the philosopher Plato said, well, there are three things. If you want to say that something is true, in fact, it has to be true. Second thing is you have to believe it to be true. And the third thing is you have to be warranted in your belief that it's true. And the warrant is really the key. What is the basis for you to say that you think something is true? Until you understand that basis, even if you're right, you can't say you know it to be true. Well, our problem in medicine is what we know and what the warrant is, and how to examine it, how to expand our ideas, how to find new solutions, how to advance the science, and how to advance patient care. That translation from the scientific question to the patient question, how to look at relative risks, how to look at benefits, how to ask whether they can be applied globally or where they fit, what the indications are. And that is part of what we want to get out of medical school, what we want to take out of residency. And, we all agree that neurosurgery is lifelong learning. So we're not done. We're still learning, no matter how much we know and where we are in our career. And these are some of the questions that we ought to ask about.
Well, Teo, I'm just looking at the clock. I think we're the longest interview that they've had. So I hope that we'll end there. That's a really, I think, a fantastically appropriate last comment. I want to thank you for communicating what you've done. I want to thank you for the relationship I've had with you. I would not have gone into neurosurgery had it not been for people that, and you were included in a very small group that was in the history section of the AANS that I came to as a senior medical student, and then really took advantage of when I was an intern, a general surgery intern at Dartmouth. There were people like you, like Sam Greenblatt, like Jim Goodrich, these people that were central in the section. In fact, I hated medical school. I thought it was a mistake that I had done to myself when I was at about the middle of my second year. I had actually really thought I would be a great archaeologist I had lived many of my young years overseas, was really enamored with various Asian cultures and African cultures. And so I thought I was going to get a job with the National Geographic Society. And then I got into medical school by some quirk. And I sat every day wondering what I had done to myself. And it was Sam Greenblatt who said, why don't you take a year off? Here's a program you can do at the Institute of the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins. And I had the really fortuitous opportunity to study the archives of Walter Dandy and to get into that literature, to see those archives, to work with them, and also to hold in my hands manuscripts by little books by Paracelsus that were held in the vault of the Welch Library. Those were thrilling for me, and it came alive. And you and those other faculty members really made my career in the history and in neurosurgery. And so much so that it was my first week at the M&I as a first-year resident, and I walked into Dr. William Feindel's office. He was taking one of his afternoon siestas there were his power naps. He had a couch in his office, and his secretary had sent me in, and so there he was, stretched out on his office couch. And I knocked on his door, kind of woke me up, and I said, Dr. Feindel, I said, do you have any projects in the history of medicine I could do that we could work on together? And I can't tell you what his face was like. He absolutely lit up. And for that time, and then in my residency, I was always involved in something that was historical. And so I want to say to you that you are one of the stalwarts of this philosophy of neurosurgery. And I think I really hope that the residents and trainees and other neurosurgeon staff, as we are, will really hear you out on this information that you've given. I want to ask for any closing remarks.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and thank you very much for having the opportunity to have this discussion. We're in a great profession, and one of the parts that should not be forgotten, people who've come before us, what has been done to get us to where we are and what we can do in the future. So thank you very much for emphasizing it the way you have done, and training your residents and fellows in the way that you have done to appreciate that and to promulgate it.
All right. Well, thank you, Teo.